The morning air bit at Maria's cheeks as she hurried down Fifth Street, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. It was barely 6 in the morning, and the city was just beginning to wake up. Street lamps flickered off one by one as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink. Maria had been making this same walk for 3 years now, ever since she'd moved to the city from her small village 2 hours away. Every morning, without fail, she stopped at the corner cafe for one small coffee. It was her only luxury, the one thing she allowed herself before starting another long day at the tailor shop. The cafe owner, an older woman named Helen, already had Maria's order ready by the time she walked through the door. They exchanged warm smiles, but few words. Maria appreciated that Helen never asked too many questions, never made her feel bad for only ordering the cheapest item on the menu. "Cold one today," Helen said, sliding the steaming cup across the counter. "Very cold," Maria agreed, wrapping her hands around the cup and savoring the warmth. She paid with exact change, counting out the coins carefully from her worn purse. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye through the cafe window. On the bench just outside, an elderly man sat hunched over, his shoulders shaking. At first, Maria thought he might be crying, but as she stepped outside, she realized he was simply shivering from the cold. The man's coat was so old that the fabric had worn thin in several places. His shoes had holes in them, and his gray hair stuck out in wild tufts from beneath a knitted cap that had seen better days. But what struck Maria most was the way he held something in his trembling hands, staring at it with such intensity that he didn't even notice her approach. Maria stood there for a moment, her own coffee warming her palms. She knew she should probably keep walking. She was already running late, and her boss at the tailor shop didn't tolerate tardiness. Besides, she barely had enough money to take care of herself. What could she really do for this stranger? But something about the way he sat there, so alone in the cold morning, pulled at something deep inside her chest. She thought of her own grandfather back in the village, how he used to sit on their porch in the early mornings watching the sunrise. She thought of how hard these past few months must have been, with winter setting in early and temperatures dropping faster than usual. Before she could talk herself out of it, Maria turned and walked back into the cafe. Helen looked up in surprise. "Forget something?" "I need another coffee," Maria said, already counting out more coins from her purse. "A large one, and maybe a breakfast sandwich too if I have enough." Helen's eyes flickered toward the window, toward the old man on the bench, and understanding crossed her face. She rang up the order but slipped an extra sandwich into the bag. "On the house," she said quietly. Maria felt her eyes sting with sudden emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. Carrying the warm bag and the large coffee, Maria pushed back through the cafe door. The old man still hadn't moved. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I thought you might be cold." The man looked up, and Maria saw eyes that were a pale, watery blue. They were red-rimmed, whether from cold or tears she couldn't tell. His weathered face showed surprise, then confusion, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was speaking to him. "This is for you," Maria said, holding out the coffee and bag. "It's too cold to be sitting out here without something warm." The old man stared at the offerings for a long moment. His hands, still clutching whatever he'd been looking at, began to shake even harder. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and cracked. I don't have any money to pay you back." "I'm not asking you to pay me back," Maria said gently. She set the coffee and bag down on the bench beside him. "Please, just take it. No one should be this cold." The man's eyes filled with tears. He carefully placed the item he'd been holding into his coat pocket and reached for the coffee with both hands. When he took his first sip, he closed his eyes and let out a long breath. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Maria found herself sitting down on the other end of the bench, even though she knew she was now definitely going to be late for work. Something told her that leaving right away would feel wrong, would make her gesture seem rushed or insincere. "I'm Maria," she said. "Robert," the old man replied. He opened the bag and pulled out one of the sandwiches, handling it like it was made of gold. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." The admission hit Maria like a physical blow. Yesterday morning. That meant this man had gone more than 24 hours without food. She thought about her own modest dinner last night, rice and beans with a little chicken. It hadn't been much, but it had been something. "Are you—" Maria hesitated, not wanting to be rude. "Do you live around here?" Robert's laugh was bitter and sad. "I live wherever I can find a place to rest. Been that way for about 4 months now." 4 months living on the streets. Maria tried to imagine what that must be like, especially as winter approached. Her own tiny apartment was barely heated and had a leak in the bathroom, but at least it was shelter. At least it was hers. "I'm sorry," she said, not knowing what else to say. Robert took another long sip of coffee, and some color seemed to return to his cheeks. "Not your fault, young lady. I made my own bed, as they say. Bad choices, too much pride, and here I am." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, which somehow made it even sadder. Maria glanced at her watch and realized she was now 15 minutes late. Her boss was definitely going to say something. But looking at Robert, at the way he held that coffee cup like it was a lifeline, she found she didn't care as much as she thought she would. "I have to go to work," she said reluctantly. "But I come by here every morning, around this same time." Robert looked at her with those watery blue eyes. "You don't have to do anything more for me. You've already done more than anyone has in a long time." "I know I don't have to," Maria said, standing up. "But maybe I'll see you tomorrow?" A small smile crossed Robert's weathered face. "Maybe you will." As Maria hurried toward the tailor shop, her hands empty now, but her heart somehow fuller, she didn't see Robert pull the item from his pocket again. She didn't see him stare at the photograph of himself and a teenage boy, both smiling at a graduation ceremony that felt like a lifetime ago. She didn't hear him whisper, "She reminds me of you, son. Kind, even when she doesn't have much to give." But she would learn all of this in time. For now, all she knew was that something had shifted in her morning routine, in her carefully budgeted life. She had just made a choice that would change everything, though she had no way of knowing it yet. All she knew was that tomorrow morning she would stop at that cafe again, and she would look for Robert on that bench, because sometimes the smallest gestures matter more than we can possibly imagine. Maria's boss had indeed noticed her lateness that first morning. Mrs. Chen had given her a long look over her glasses and tapped her watch meaningfully. But Maria had apologized and gotten straight to work, her fingers flying over the alterations that needed to be finished by noon. The next morning, Maria woke up even earlier. She packed an extra apple from her small kitchen and left her apartment while it was still dark outside. When she reached the cafe, Robert was already there on the same bench, wrapped in what looked like a donated blanket that hadn't been there the day before. His face lit up when he saw her, and Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee she carried. "You came back," Robert said, and there was such genuine surprise in his voice that Maria's heart squeezed. "I said I would," she replied simply, handing him the coffee and a muffin she'd managed to afford. "And I brought you this apple for later." This became their routine. Every morning for the next 2 weeks, Maria stopped to spend 15 minutes with Robert before heading to work. She learned to leave her apartment earlier so she wouldn't be late to the tailor shop. Sometimes she could only afford to bring him coffee. Other days, when she'd gotten a small tip from a customer, she brought food too. And slowly, Like a flower opening its petals to the sun, Robert began to share his story. He'd been an architect once, he told her on the third morning. A good one, too, with his own firm and a beautiful house in the suburbs. He pulled out the photograph he always carried, showing her a younger version of himself standing next to a teenage boy in a graduation gown. "That's my son, James," Robert said, his finger tracing the boy's face. "This was taken at his high school graduation. He was so smart, Maria, top of his class, got accepted to MIT for engineering." "You must be very proud," Maria said. Robert's expression darkened. "I was, but I was also a fool." Over the following days, the story came out in pieces. James had wanted to study computer science and software engineering, but Robert had built a successful architecture firm and expected his only son to take over the family business. When James refused, choosing his own path instead, Robert had been furious. "I said terrible things," Robert admitted one morning, staring into his coffee cup. "I told him he was throwing away his future, that he was ungrateful. I told him if he walked away from the family business, he was walking away from the family." "What did he do?" Maria asked quietly. "He left anyway. Went to MIT, graduated, started working for some tech company in California. He tried to reach out a few times over the years, but I was too proud, too stubborn. I kept waiting for him to admit I was right, to come back and apologize." Robert's voice cracked. "And he never did." Maria let the silence sit between them for a moment before speaking. "And your business?" "Gone. I made some bad investments about 5 years ago. Trusted the wrong people, lost everything slowly, then all at once. The house, the savings, the firm. I was too ashamed to reach out to James then. Too proud to admit I'd been wrong about everything." He laughed bitterly. "Pride, Maria. That's what destroyed my life. Pride and stubbornness." Maria thought about her own life, her own choices. She told Robert about growing up in a small village, about her mother who cleaned houses and her father who worked in a factory, about how she'd always loved sewing, creating beautiful things with her hands. "My parents wanted me to become a teacher or a nurse," she shared one morning. "Something stable, something safe. But I wanted to design clothes. I wanted to create something beautiful." "Did they support you?" Robert asked. "Eventually. But at first they thought I was being foolish. They didn't understand why I'd come to the city to work in a tailor shop for barely any money when I could have had a steady job back home." Maria smiled softly. "But I send them money every month, and I take night classes in fashion design at the community college. One day I'm going to have my own boutique." Robert's eyes brightened. "You will, I can tell. You have that determination." "How can you tell?" "Because you're here every morning, spending your hard-earned money on an old homeless man you barely know. That takes a special kind of heart. People with that kind of heart make their dreams happen." Their conversations became the best part of Maria's day. Robert had lived a full life, even with all his mistakes, and he had wisdom to share. He told her about architecture, about how buildings should make people feel something. He gave her advice about her designs, looking at sketches she sometimes brought along. "This one," he said one morning, pointing to a dress design. "The lines are too rigid here. See? Let it flow more naturally like water. Architecture and fashion aren't so different. Both are about creating something that's beautiful and functional." Maria made the changes, and when she showed the revised sketch to her night class instructor, the teacher had been impressed. "This is much better," the instructor said. "You're really developing your eye." But Maria also noticed that Robert was getting thinner. Even with the food she brought, it wasn't enough. The nights were getting colder, and more than once she saw him shivering despite the layers of clothing he'd accumulated. "Robert," she said one morning, about 3 weeks into their friendship, "there are shelters. Places where you can stay warm, get regular meals." He shook his head firmly. "I've tried them. They're full most nights, and the ones that aren't—" He trailed off. It's not safe for someone my age. Things get stolen. People get hurt. Maria felt frustrated and helpless. What good was bringing coffee and muffins when what Robert really needed was a home, medical care, and his family back? One particularly cold morning, Robert told her more about James. He works for some big tech company now. I looked it up once at the library before I lost my phone and couldn't afford another one. He's done well for himself, better than he ever would have done working for my firm. Have you thought about contacting him? Maria asked carefully. Every single day, but what would I say? Sorry I destroyed our relationship because I was too proud to let you live your own life, and by the way, I'm homeless now? Robert shook his head. He's better off without me. I don't think that's true, Maria said. I think about my parents every day. Even when we disagreed, even when things were hard, I never stopped loving them, and they never stopped loving me. You're a good daughter, Robert said. James deserved a father like you are a daughter. It's not too late, Maria insisted. It's never too late. But Robert just smiled sadly and changed the subject. He asked about her latest project at the tailor shop, about her classes, about anything other than his son. As Maria walked to work that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Winter was deepening. Robert was getting weaker. And somewhere out in California, a man named James had no idea his father was sitting on a cold bench every morning, clutching a photograph from 20 years ago. Something had to change. Maria just didn't know what she could do about it. She was just a seamstress who could barely afford an extra coffee each morning. What difference could she really make in the face of years of separation and pain? But she would keep showing up. She would keep bringing what little she could. Because if there was one thing Maria had learned from her own parents, it was that love shows up consistently, even when it feels like it's not enough, even when you don't know if it matters. She would be there tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, for as long as Robert needed her to be. The first week of December brought snow and temperatures that made Maria's bones ache even inside her apartment. She couldn't imagine what Robert must be feeling, spending his nights outside in this weather. She'd started bringing him thicker items when she could find them at thrift stores. A scarf one day, gloves the next. They were small things, barely enough, but Robert accepted each gift with tears in his eyes and gratitude that made Maria feel both good and heartbroken at the same time. On Tuesday morning, Maria noticed Robert's cough. It was deep and rattling, the kind that shook his whole body. His face looked pale, almost gray, and his hands trembled more than usual as he tried to hold the coffee she'd brought. Robert, that cough sounds bad. You should see a doctor, Maria said, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Can't afford a doctor, he said simply, then coughed again so hard he had to lean forward. It'll pass. Just a cold. But it didn't pass. Each morning that week, Robert looked worse. The cough got deeper. His eyes became glassy and unfocused. On Friday, Maria brought him soup from a small restaurant, spending money she'd been saving for her textbooks next semester. You need to eat this while it's hot, she urged, practically forcing the container into his hands. Robert managed a few sips before another coughing fit overtook him. Maria watched helplessly, her heart pounding with fear. This wasn't just a cold anymore. This was something serious. Promise me you'll try to get inside somewhere tonight, Maria pleaded. The shelter, the church, anywhere. I'll try, Robert said, but she could see in his eyes that he probably wouldn't. Too many nights turned away, too much disappointment. He'd rather take his chances with the cold than face another rejection. That weekend, Maria couldn't stop thinking about Robert. She spent Saturday at the tailor shop, working extra hours to make up for the money she'd been spending. Mrs. Chen noticed her distraction and asked if everything was okay. Just worried about a friend, Maria said, not wanting to explain the whole situation. Mrs. Chen looked at her thoughtfully. The old man you've been buying coffee for? Maria's head snapped up in surprise. She didn't realize anyone had noticed. "I see you every morning through the window," Mrs. Chen said, her voice softer than usual. "You have a good heart, Maria. But you can't save everyone, especially not by yourself." "I know," Maria whispered, "but I have to try." Sunday night. Maria barely slept. The temperature was supposed to drop below freezing. She lay awake in her small bed, wearing 2 sweaters because her radiator barely worked, and thought about Robert out there in the cold. She prayed he'd found somewhere safe to stay. Monday morning came with freezing rain. Maria rushed to the cafe earlier than usual, her heart in her throat. The bench was empty, relief and worry mixed together in her chest. Maybe Robert had finally gone to a shelter. Maybe he'd found somewhere warm. But Tuesday morning he wasn't there either. Or Wednesday. By Thursday, Maria was frantic. She asked Helen at the cafe if she'd seen him. She walked up and down the surrounding blocks, checking doorways and alcoves where homeless people sometimes took shelter. Nothing. Friday morning arrived with clear skies, but brutal cold. Maria made her usual stop at the cafe, not really expecting to see Robert but unable to break the routine. And there he was, back on his bench. But something was terribly wrong. Robert was slumped over, barely moving. His breathing came in short, wheezing gasps. Even from several feet away, Maria could see he was trembling uncontrollably. "Robert!" She ran to him, her coffee forgotten. "Robert, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. He tried to speak but only managed a weak cough. His skin was burning hot when Maria touched his forehead, yet he was shivering like he was freezing. "I'm calling an ambulance," Maria said, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Robert tried to shake his head, tried to protest, but he didn't have the strength. Maria had already dialed. The operator's voice was calm and professional. "What's your emergency?" "There's a man here. He's very sick. He has a high fever and he can't breathe properly. Please, you have to send someone right away." The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours to Maria. The paramedics moved quickly, checking Robert's vital signs, asking questions. Maria answered what she could, but she realized how little she actually knew about him. His last name, his birthday, his medical history, all of it was a mystery. What she did know was that his temperature was dangerously high and his oxygen levels were too low. The paramedics said words like pneumonia and possible hypothermia and critical condition. "Are you family?" one of the paramedics asked Maria as they loaded Robert into the ambulance. "No, I'm just a friend." "You should call his family. He's going to need someone." Maria climbed into the ambulance without thinking twice. She knew she should call work, should explain why she wouldn't be coming in, but all of that seemed distant and unimportant. Robert was barely conscious, his breath fogging the oxygen mask they'd placed over his face. At the hospital, everything became a blur of forms and questions. Maria did her best to answer, but kept having to say, "I don't know," over and over. She gave them her own contact information, the only information she had to give. They took Robert away behind heavy double doors, and a nurse directed Maria to the waiting room. She sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing her coat, and realized she was shaking. She should leave. She should go to work, go home, go back to her normal life. Mrs. Chen was probably furious. Maria would probably lose her job. She couldn't afford the time off, couldn't afford to sit in this hospital waiting room for who knew how many hours. But she couldn't make herself leave. Maria pulled out her phone to call Mrs. Chen and explain. That's when she remembered Robert's photograph, the one he always carried. She'd seen it so many times over the past few weeks. She'd seen the proud father and the graduating son, their arms around each other, both smiling. An idea formed in her mind, crazy and impulsive. She walked up to the reception desk. "The man who just came in, Robert, do you still have his belongings? His clothes?" The nurse looked uncertain. We had to cut off his coat because it was wet and making him colder. Why? There's a photograph. He always keeps it in his coat pocket. It's important. The nurse disappeared for a moment and returned with a plastic bag containing Robert's wet, tattered coat. Maria's hands shook as she reached into the pocket and found the photograph, slightly damp but intact. She turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, it said, James, MIT graduation, 1998, and below that, a phone number with a California area code. Maria stared at that number for a long time. This was crossing a line. This was getting involved in family business that wasn't hers. Robert had chosen not to call his son. Who was she to make that choice for him? But then she thought about Robert lying in that hospital bed, critically ill and alone. She thought about a man in California who had no idea his father was fighting for his life. She thought about her own father, how she would want to know if something happened to him, no matter how complicated their relationship might be. Before she could second-guess herself, Maria pulled out her phone and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a man's voice answered. Hello? Maria's throat felt tight. Hi, my name is Maria. I'm calling about Robert. I think he might be your father. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, Is he okay? Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. No, he's not. He's at City General Hospital. He's very sick. I think you should come. Another pause, longer this time. Maria could hear breathing on the other end, could almost feel the man processing this information, making calculations and decisions. Finally, James spoke again. I'll be on the next flight. Please, can you stay with him? Don't let him be alone. I won't, Maria promised. I'll be right here. She hung up and looked down at the photograph in her hand. The young man in the graduation gown was coming home. After all these years, after all the hurt and silence, he was coming home. Maria just hoped he wouldn't be too late. Maria spent the rest of that day in the hospital waiting room. She called Mrs. Chen and explained everything, expecting to be fired on the spot. Instead, her boss had simply said, Take care of your friend. We'll manage here. The hours crawled by. Nurses came and went, but no one would tell her much. Robert was stable, they said. He was getting treatment. Someone would update her when there was more information. Around 3 in the afternoon, Maria finally allowed herself to walk down to the cafeteria. She bought a cup of coffee and a sandwich, though she could barely taste either one. Her mind kept replaying the phone call with James, the way his voice had cracked when he asked if his father was okay. She was back in the waiting room when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize with a California area code. Hello? Maria, this is James. I'm at the airport. My flight board's in 20 minutes. I should be there by 10 tonight. He paused. How is he? They said he's stable. They're treating him for pneumonia and hypothermia. I haven't been able to see him yet. Thank God you were there. James's voice was thick with emotion. Thank God someone was looking out for him. Can you tell me what happened? How long has he been? Maria told him everything. About meeting Robert 4 weeks ago, about their morning routine, about how she'd noticed him getting sicker. She told him about the cough that wouldn't go away and how she'd found him collapsed that morning. 4 weeks, James repeated quietly. You've been taking care of him for 4 weeks. It wasn't much, just coffee and food sometimes. I wish I could have done more. You did more than anyone else. James's voice broke slightly. You did more than I did, and I'm his son. He talked about you all the time, Maria said softly. He carried your graduation photo everywhere. He was so proud of you, James, so proud and so sorry. She heard James take a shaky breath. I tried to find him, you know. About 2 years ago, I hired a private investigator. But Dad had moved so many times, changed his name at one point. The trail went cold. He laughed bitterly. And all this time he was right there in the same city where I grew up. They talked for a few more minutes before James had to board his plane. Maria promised to text him updates, to stay with Robert as much as the hospital would allow. The evening shift brought a different nurse, an older woman with kind eyes. Maria explained the situation, and the nurse bent the rules a little, letting Maria peek into Robert's room for just a moment. He looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes. His face was still pale, but his breathing seemed easier with the oxygen mask. Maria whispered a quick prayer and went back to the waiting room. She must have dozed off at some point because the next thing she knew, someone was gently shaking her shoulder. Maria blinked awake to find a man standing over her. He was probably in his mid-40s, wearing an expensive-looking coat and carrying a leather bag. His eyes were the same pale blue as Robert's. "Maria?" She sat up quickly. "James?" He nodded, and she could see how exhausted he looked. "I got an earlier flight. They let me see him for a minute. He's sleeping." James sat down heavily in the chair next to her. "I can't believe he's really here. After all this time." They sat in silence for a moment. Then James turned to her. "Tell me about him, about how he was these past few weeks. I need to know." So Maria told him. She told him about Robert's wisdom, his advice about her designs, the way he'd light up when talking about architecture. She told him about their conversations, about how Robert spoke of his son with such regret and longing. "He kept saying he'd been too proud," Maria said. "That pride had destroyed his life. He wanted to reach out to you, but he was ashamed. Ashamed of losing everything, of ending up on the streets. He thought you were better off without him." James wiped at his eyes. "He was wrong. I was never better off without him. Yes, we fought. Yes, he said terrible things. But he was still my father." He pulled out his phone and showed Maria a photo of a young woman and two small children. "This is my daughter Amy and her kids. Dad has grandchildren he's never met. A great-grandchild on the way." He didn't know? How could he? "We lost touch 15 years ago. I got married, had Amy, built my company. Life moved on. But there wasn't a day I didn't think about him, didn't wonder if he was okay." James put his phone away. "I should have tried harder to find him." "He should have called you," Maria said gently. "You both made mistakes. But you're here now. That's what matters." Around midnight, a doctor came out to talk to James. Robert's condition had improved slightly. The antibiotics were working, and his temperature was coming down. But he was still weak, still critical. The next 48 hours would tell them more. James thanked the doctor and turned back to Maria. "You should go home. Get some rest. You've done so much already." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I'll stay with him. I'm not leaving." Maria gathered her things, but before she left, she pulled out Robert's photograph and handed it to James. He carried this with him every single day. James took the photo with trembling hands, staring at the image of his younger self with his father. "I remember this day. I was so happy. We both were." He looked up at Maria with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. For everything. For being there when I couldn't be." Maria went home and collapsed into bed, but sleep was hard to come by. She kept thinking about Robert and James, about all those lost years. She thought about her own parents back in the village and made a mental note to call them in the morning. The next day, Maria went back to work. Mrs. Chen asked about Robert, and Maria shared the update. Several of the other seamstresses gathered around to listen, and before Maria knew it, they were pooling money together. "For when he gets out of the hospital," one of them said, "he'll need clothes, food, a place to stay." Maria felt overwhelmed by their generosity. "You don't even know him." "We know you," Mrs. Chen said simply, "and that's enough." That evening, Maria returned to the hospital. She found James in the waiting room, looking more rested than he had the night before. "He woke up an hour ago," James said, a smile breaking across his tired face. "Really woke up, I mean. Recognized me." "What did he say?" "He said, 'I'm sorry,' over and over. 'I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry.'" James wiped his eyes. "And I told him I was sorry, too. For not trying harder, for letting pride keep us apart. We both cried like babies." Maria felt her own tears coming. "Can I see him?" "He's been asking for you. Keeps talking about the angel who brought him coffee every morning." They walked to Robert's room together. He was awake, still hooked up to various machines, but looking so much better than he had 2 days ago. His eyes were clear, and when he saw Maria, his whole face lit up. "There she is," Robert said, his voice raspy but stronger. "My guardian angel." "I'm not an angel," Maria said, taking his hand. "Just someone who believes people deserve kindness." "You brought my son back to me," Robert said. "If that's not an angel, I don't know what is." James stood on the other side of the bed, his hand on his father's shoulder. "The doctor says he'll make a full recovery. It'll take time, but he's going to be okay." "And then what?" Robert asked quietly. "I have nowhere to go, James. I lost everything." "You're coming home with me," James said firmly. "To California. No arguments." "James, I can't." "Yes, you can. And you will." James's voice was gentle but firm. "We've lost enough time, Dad. I'm not losing any more." Robert looked at his son, then at Maria, then back at his son. Fresh tears rolled down his cheeks. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Maria squeezed Robert's hand and quietly stepped back, giving the two men their moment. She watched as father and son embraced for the first time in 15 years, both of them crying, both of them finally healing. And she thought about how strange life was, how one small act of kindness could ripple outward in ways you never expected, how buying a cup of coffee for a stranger could bring a family back together. She thought about all the mornings she'd almost walked past Robert, almost convinced herself she couldn't afford to help. And she thanked God that she'd stopped that first day, that she'd listened to the small voice in her heart that told her to reach out. Sometimes, Maria realized, the smallest gestures create the biggest miracles. Robert spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering. Maria visited him every evening after work, sometimes bringing sketches to show him, sometimes just sitting quietly while he slept. James stayed in town the entire time, working remotely from a hotel and spending his days at his father's bedside. On Maria's visits, she got to know James better. He told her about his tech company, how he'd started it from nothing 12 years ago and built it into something successful. He showed her pictures of his family, his daughter who was a teacher, his 2 grandchildren who loved science experiments and building blocks. "Amy wants to meet him so badly," James said one evening. "She's been asking about her grandfather since she was little. I told her we'd had a fight, that I didn't know where he was. She never stopped asking." "She'll get to meet him now," Maria said. "That's what matters." Robert got stronger each day. The color returned to his face, and his cough gradually disappeared. The doctors were amazed at his recovery, calling it remarkable for someone his age who'd been through so much. One evening, about 10 days into his hospital stay, Robert asked to speak with Maria alone. James stepped out to get coffee, leaving them in the quiet room with just the steady beep of monitors. "I've been thinking," Robert said, taking Maria's hand, "about everything that happened, about how close I came to dying alone on that bench." He squeezed her hand gently. "You saved my life, Maria. Not just by calling the ambulance. You saved my life weeks before that, by seeing me as a person worth sitting with." "Anyone would have done the same," Maria said. "But they didn't. Hundreds of people walked past that bench every day. You were the only one who stopped." Robert's eyes were serious now. James and I have been talking. We want to do something for you. Maria shook her head quickly. You don't owe me anything. I'm just happy you're okay and that you're back together with your son. Let me finish, Robert said with a small smile. James showed me those sketches you brought, the dress designs. Maria, you're talented, really talented. Thank you, but... And James told me about your dream, about wanting to open your own boutique someday. Robert shifted in his bed, sitting up straighter. What if someday could be sooner than you think? Before Maria could respond, James came back in carrying 3 cups of coffee. He handed one to Maria and one to his father, then pulled up a chair. Did you tell her? James asked. I was just getting to it, Robert said. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. Maria, my company does well, very well. And one of the things we've started doing is investing in small businesses, particularly ones started by people who show exceptional character and vision. Maria's heart started beating faster. I don't understand. We want to invest in your boutique, James said simply. We want to help you make your dream happen. Maria felt like all the air had left the room. I can't accept that. It's too much. It's not nearly enough, Robert said. You gave me back my son, Maria. You gave me back my life. This is the least we can do. But I'm not ready. I don't have a business plan or a location or... That's what the investment includes, James interrupted gently. Business planning, location scouting, startup capital, everything you need. And my father has agreed to consult on the design of the space. Turns out having an architect in the family might come in handy. Maria looked between them, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Robert urged. Let us help you the way you helped us. This feels like a dream, Maria whispered. Dreams are supposed to feel impossible right up until they come true, James said with a smile. Maria said yes. How could she say anything else? The next few weeks passed in a blur. Robert was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to rest and follow up with doctors in California. Before he left, there was one more thing he wanted to do. He asked Maria to take him back to the bench where she'd first found him. James pushed his father's wheelchair along the familiar street, and Maria walked beside them, carrying the coffee she'd bought from Helen's cafe. They sat there together, the 3 of them, on a cold January morning. Robert looked at the bench, at the cafe, at the street where he'd spent so many desperate mornings. I won't miss this, Robert said quietly. But I'll never forget it either. This is where I hit bottom. And this is where an angel found me. Stop calling me that, Maria said, but she was smiling. Never, Robert replied. Helen came out of the cafe with a bag of pastries. For your trip, she said to Robert, safe travels. They'd become friends too, Helen and Robert, during those morning visits. The cafe owner had her own story about hard times and second chances, and she'd found a kindred spirit in the old man on the bench. Thank you, Robert said, accepting the bag. For everything. 2 days later, Maria went to the airport to see them off. James's private plane would take them back to California, where a new life waited for Robert. A room in James's house, doctors who could monitor his health, a family eager to meet him. I'll miss our morning talks, Maria said, hugging Robert carefully. We'll video call, Robert promised. Every week, and you'll come visit once the boutique is open. I want to see it in person. It's a deal. James hugged her too. I'll be back in 2 weeks to start working on the business plan with you. In the meantime, my assistant will be in touch about locations. Maria watched their plane take off, feeling both sad and hopeful at the same time. She'd lost her morning routine with Robert, but she'd gained something so much bigger. 3 months later, Maria stood in front of a small storefront in a busy part of the city. The space was empty now, but she could see it all in her mind. The racks of clothes, the fitting rooms, the design studio in the back. James had helped her find the perfect location, and Robert had drawn up beautiful plans for the interior. The sign above the door read, "Second Chances Boutique," in elegant letters. It had been Robert's idea for the name. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he'd said during one of their video calls. "Including old fools like me and young dreamers like you?" Maria's parents had come up from the village for the grand opening. Her mother couldn't stop crying happy tears, and her father kept shaking his head in amazement. Mrs. Chen and all the seamstresses from the tailor shop were there too, along with customers Maria had helped over the years. And on a video call displayed on a tablet in the corner, Robert and James watched from California. Robert's daughter Amy was there too, holding her baby, Robert's first great-grandchild, born just 2 weeks earlier. "We wish we could be there in person," James said through the screen. "You are here," Maria replied, gesturing around the shop. "This is only here because of you. All of you." As the first customers began to filter in, Maria thought about that cold morning 4 months ago. She thought about a young seamstress who almost walked past a suffering stranger. She thought about how easily she could have kept walking, kept her coffee and her money and her time to herself. She thought about how one small choice, one moment of compassion, had changed 3 lives forever. Mrs. Chen came up beside her. "You did it," her former boss said proudly. "I always knew you would." "I didn't do it alone," Maria said, looking around at all the people who'd supported her, the people she'd helped and who'd helped her in return. That evening, after the last customer left and Maria was alone in her boutique, she walked to the window and looked out at the street. Somewhere in California, an old man was holding his great-grandchild for the first time, surrounded by family he'd thought he'd lost forever. Somewhere in the city, people were walking past each other, lost in their own worlds, maybe not seeing the person on the bench who needed help. Maria made a silent promise to herself. She would never stop seeing those people. She would never stop believing that small acts of kindness could change the world, because she'd lived it. She'd seen it happen. A cup of coffee and 15 minutes had saved a life, reunited a family, and made her dreams come true. If that wasn't proof that kindness mattered, that every person deserved to be seen and valued, then what was? Maria turned off the lights in her boutique and locked the door. Tomorrow she would come back and do it all again. She would design beautiful things, help her customers feel confident and special, and build something lasting. But she would also keep her eyes open for the person on the bench, for the stranger who needed a kind word or a warm meal, for the next opportunity to show that the world was still full of good people who cared. Because in the end, that's what life was really about. Not the boutiques or the businesses or the success. It was about the connections we made, the people we helped, and the love we shared with strangers who became family. Maria smiled as she walked home through the cold evening air. She had a feeling Robert would call tonight, wanting to hear every detail about the opening day. And she would tell him everything, just like she used to on those morning visits to his hospital bed. Some routines were worth keeping, even when everything else changed. And some friendships, born from the simplest acts of human kindness, lasted forever.